Welcome back now for the news in detail. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan will address the 74th session of the United Nations General Assembly today. In his speech, he will highlight the worsening human rights situation in Indian-occupied Kashmir under New Delhi's lockdown. Khan will also hold a meeting with the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres on the sidelines. Earlier, speaking at the Dialogue on Financing for Development, Khan called for a closure of tax havens. He called for effective measures to combat money laundering, corruption and tax evasion. He said these sanctuaries of ill-gotten money are devastating developing countries across the world. The United States says it wants New Delhi to immediately lift restrictions in Indian-occupied Kashmir. State Department South Asia official Alice Wells asked New Delhi to release detained political leaders. Talking to reporters in Washington, she said Washington is concerned over imprisonment of politicians and businessmen. Wells called on the Indian government to resume political engagement with Kashmiri leaders. She said the world will benefit from reduced tensions between Pakistan and India. She said President Donald Trump is willing to mediate if asked by both parties. Pakistan boycotted the opening statement of Indian External Affairs Minister Subrahmanyam Jaishankar at the SAARC meeting in New York. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi said Pakistan will not engage with the butchers of Kashmir unless India lifts its siege of occupied Kashmir. Meanwhile, Pakistan says it is ready to host the 19th summit of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation in Islamabad. Qureshi said dates for the summit will be proposed soon. He said no member countries have objected to the summit's venue. In Indian-occupied Kashmir, schools and colleges are forced to shut down by Indian Army amid almost 2 months-long region-wide clampdown. Prompted by the crackdown, Kashmiri students have resorted to using their own resources, setting up a makeshift school to give lessons to 200 children. This report will tell you more.
With books in hand, poems on lips and fear in eyes, little girls and boys are determined to continue their education. Conflict and fear has caused palpable impacts on civilian life in Kashmir, particularly for children. The closures and violence in the occupied valley has led to student uprisings and protests. The students see their education put at risk and being militarized.
Education of children is suffering right now. We will not let our future generations suffer. We will teach them as much as we can. Until the time the situation is bad here, we will teach them.
Other students are providing basic medical care as well, so people don't have to leave houses for fear of arrest. Rubina said her 15-year-old son was injured by pellets fired by security forces while he was returning home from Friday prayers.
I was scared. I kept him in my neighbor's home, who took care of him and are taking care of him. I kept him somewhere else because I was scared.
Indian authorities have arrested nearly 4,000 people since the revocation of Kashmir's special status.
Meanwhile, in Pakistan, rallies were held across the country to mark Kashmir Solidarity Day. Pakistan's Interior Minister issued a theme, "Let's Save the Innocent Children of Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir," to commute the day. The occupied valley has been under India's lockdown for 54 days. The Afghan government deployed more than 100,000 troops to guard polling stations for Saturday's presidential elections. Taliban say they will block all roads on polling day and attack all election activities. One of the 18 contesting candidates, Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, has also threatened violence if the government rigs elections. Former MP for Faryab Bashir Ahmed Tayanj says majority districts are not secure enough to hold elections. He ruled out polling in at least 20 districts across Maidan Vardak, Ghazni, Faryab and Nuristan province. In Afghanistan, people will go to the polls on Saturday to elect the country's next president. They will be able to choose between the 6 candidates who have emerged on the mainstream political scene. This reflects the divisions in the electorate as a whole. More details in this report.
According to Afghan Independent Electoral Commission, some 9.6 million registered voters across the country will be eligible to cast their votes. The election was originally scheduled for April but has been frequently delayed by security, economic and political issues at home and abroad. The domestic security situation in the country has further deteriorated since the suspension of peace talks between the US and the Taliban.
The biggest problem for Afghanistan is safety. Every day, different people come to my shop and complain to me that it's not safe out there. If we don't have a safe environment, we have no business to do.
Many Afghans fear these elections won't do the country much good either. Merchants are disappointed about the slow development of urban infrastructure and business opportunities. People don't seem satisfied with President Ashraf Ghani's tenure and are pessimistic that a lot won't change unless the security situation improves. Therefore, voter turnout is expected to be fairly low.
I'm not going to vote this time because there are no viable candidates. Last time I voted, but the result was not satisfactory. I haven't seen much change in the last 5 years.
For all the mixed opinions, the security situation in Afghanistan remains the most pressing concern for the population.
Now, for more on this, we are joined by Mr. James Dorsey, Singapore-based political analyst. Thank you for your time. Mr. Dorsey, the Taliban have recently threatened to jeopardize Saturday's elections. So how serious is this threat?
I would take the threat very serious. Yes, we've seen a number of attacks already, particularly since the breakdown in negotiations when U.S. President Trump canceled a meeting with Taliban leaders. And the Taliban have made very clear that negotiations with the United States is not reason enough to bring a halt, at least even temporarily, to their armed endeavors.
And Mr. Dorsey, in the current circumstances, when we have seen so many recent attacks by the Taliban, what are the chances of the Afghan government defeating the threat and winning the confidence of the voters to persuade them to cast their ballots?
I think it's a very fragile situation, and turnout is going to be very important in terms of the legitimacy of the government in these elections. Problem, of course, is you're talking about elections in a country in which the government does not have total control over all of its territory, and therefore, by definition already, there is a question mark of how representative the government is.
And lastly, Mr. Dorsey, what do you think will be the effect of the 2019 elections on Afghanistan? Will it be negative, or do you think it can help the country? And what do you think the future will be of Ashraf Ghani?
I think there are various layers here. First of all, if they pull off the elections on Saturday reasonably well, then of course that will be seen as a success for the government, whoever heads it after that, and the Afghan government's backers, particularly the United States, will project that as a success. The election in itself, really, what it matters will only depend on how the solution to the Afghan conflict is constructed. So up until now, we've really had a situation in which the United States was talking about the withdrawal of U.S. forces with the Taliban, and those negotiations focused primarily on two issues: a timetable for the U.S. withdrawal and Taliban commitments that they would not engage in transnational political violence. That's a problem for the government, because if by not including the government in these negotiations, obviously the United States is sending a signal, and that raises questions for the future of whoever is going to be president, whether that's Ashraf Ghani or someone else.
Right, Mr. James Dorsey, thank you for joining us on Indus News. Now, the US has announced the deployment of 200 troops for Sentinel radar systems and Patriot missiles to Saudi Arabia. The Pentagon says the arrangement will bolster Riyadh's defense of military and civilian infrastructure. In a statement, the US military said it is putting additional capabilities on prepare to deploy orders. 2 more Patriot batteries and a missile defense system will be prepared to go in case of a crisis. The move comes in the aftermath of the September 14th attacks on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities. Now, Saudi Arabia calls for global action against Iran, accusing it of the recent attacks on the Aramco's oil facilities. In his speech at the UN General Assembly, Saudi Foreign Minister Ibrahim bin Abdul Aziz Al Assaf called the strike a real test of the international community's will. He said Iran has jeopardized world's energy supplies as well as international peace and the global economy. Assaf said that Iran's sources of finance should be cut off until it re-announces its ballistic missile program. The foreign minister said the kingdom has never promoted war but will defend its sovereignty. Meanwhile, at a press conference in New York, Iran's President Hassan Rouhani said Iran had nothing to do with the attacks. Meanwhile, Turkey says it will continue its trade with Iran despite the threat of US sanctions. Speaking in Ankara, President Tayyip Erdogan said it is impossible for his country to stop buying oil and gas from Tehran. Earlier, Erdogan warned against blaming Iran for the attacks on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities. He said it will be inappropriate to put the entire burden on Tehran without sufficient evidence. The British-flagged Stena Impero oil tanker has left the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas and begun its journey home. The vessel was detained by Iran's Revolutionary Guard in the Strait of Hormuz for alleged marine violations in July. Tracking data shows the Stena has set a new destination for UAE's port Rashid in Dubai. Iranian authorities accuse the tanker of failing to observe international maritime law at the time of its seizure. The Impero was held after Britain seized an Iranian tanker off the territory of Gibraltar. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas says he is committed to a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Speaking at the United General Assembly, Abbas said he will not cede to an emboldened Israeli stance. The Palestinian leader called for the UN to be a mediator in peace talks between Palestine and Israel, and said he will not accept sole U.S. mediation. He said recent developments, including the U.S. decision to declare Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, have jeopardized a future two-state solution.
A week before the recent Israeli elections, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu came to arrogantly announce that should he prevail in the elections, he would annex and apply Israeli sovereignty to the Jordan Valley, Northern Dead Sea, and Israel's colonial settlements, despite the fact that all these areas are occupied Palestinian territory. We reject entirely and completely this plan.
It's time for a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. The European Union says Britain will be responsible if the talks for a Brexit deal fail. In an interview, EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker said the bloc is doing all it can to avoid a no deal. Juncker said he and Brexit negotiator Michel Barnier are working for an agreement. He said it will be a disaster for both Britain and the EU if the UK leaves without a proper withdrawal. But British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says his government is confident that the UK can leave the European Union with a deal.
No, I must say that we will obey the law, but we're confident we can come out on October the 31st. And the best way to do that is to get a deal. And so that's why the Surrender Act is so damaging, because I won't hide it from you, it has had the effect with our European friends of making them think, maybe Parliament can block this thing. Maybe they will be forced to extend. And
now, Japan has raised its threat level for both China and North Korea. An annual defense paper approved by the cabinet today underscores the country's fear of being targeted by its neighbors. The paper points to North Korea's development of miniature ballistic warheads and the absence of any concrete steps on denuclearization. It said Pyongyang is now trying to increase missile ranges, accuracy, and surprise attack capability. The defense report also noted China's threat is expanding into space from regional seas and says Tokyo must prioritize space security. For the first time in its history, Saudi Arabia has opened its doors to foreign tourists as part of its economic and social reforms. The kingdom has announced visit visas for 49 countries in a push to diversify its oil-centric economy. Until now, foreigners traveling to Saudi Arabia were largely restricted to resident workers and business travelers. Tourism Chief Ahmed Al-Khatib said visas will be available online for about $80 with no restrictions for unaccompanied women. Al-Khatib said investing in the kingdom's tourism sector is a great opportunity for foreign investors. But he clarified that access to the Muslims' holy cities of Mecca and Medina will continue to be restricted. The Saudi official said headscarves will not be mandatory for women tourists, but he said a modest dress will be mandatory, including at public beaches. The Pakistan Navy is conducting a maritime exercise, Ribat 2019, in the North Arabian Sea to review operational preparedness of its forces. In a statement, the Pakistan Navy says the exercise is aimed at validating tactical war fighting procedures. During the exercise, successful rehearsals of live missile firings was held from surface and air platforms. The Pakistan Air Force is also participating in the maritime exercise. Pakistan Navy Chief Admiral Zafar Mahmood Abbasi witnessed the missile firing and expressed his satisfaction on the operational readiness of the forces. Moving on, tens of thousands of students have gathered across New Zealand for a second global school strike for climate change. The latest round of protests built on last week's marches by millions of children around the world. The organizers of School Strike for Climate reported 170,000 people protested nationwide. Students delivered a petition to Parliament calling on the government to declare a climate emergency. Now it's just time for a short break. We'll be back with the news.